Loved and denounced in equal measure, Israel is a country that generates a great deal of controversy. What's happening right now in Gaza is a good example of this. For some, the war against Hamas is entirely justified. For others, however, Netanyahu's government has gone too far and a humanitarian disaster is unfolding. Probably both are true, but the fact is that whenever we talk about Israel, we usually do so to comment on its military operations, some incredible action by Mossad, or its foreign policy. However, there's a much lesser known side to the story. In recent decades, Israel has been a true economic and financial miracle, and that's exactly what we're going to look at in this video. Because the case of Israel is so paradoxical that while missiles were falling on Tel Aviv, the local stock market was taking off like a rocket. The result? In the midst of war with Iran, while the world expected chaos, panic, and capital flight, Israel experienced one of the best financial moments in its modern history. That's why today in this video we're going to delve into the surprising economic and financial miracle of Israel. This is the other side, the lesser known side of what is probably the most controversial country in the world right now. Let's get started.
Plus 100% since October 7th. Tel Aviv pulverizes the S&P 500 in the midst of war.
The markets have spoken and the verdict is very clear. Israel is not only winning on the battlefield, it's also sweeping the board on what is probably the most important front for the future, the economic and financial war. Yes, you heard correctly. In the midst of war, when it would be logical to see red figures, recession and capital flight, it turns out that Israel is experiencing one of the best financial moments in decades. Practically one of the best financial moments in its entire history. Do you want an example? Well, let's go back to last June. I'm sure you will remember what happened. Suddenly, without warning and completely unilaterally, Israel launched one of the most ambitious military operations in its entire history. A large-scale military operation against the Ayatollah regime, specifically against infrastructure linked to Iran's nuclear program. The scale of the operations was brutal. Keep in mind that around 200 Israeli Air Force planes took part in the first attack alone, a wildly large deployment. So large that, to give you an idea, it's likely that few countries in Europe would be capable of mounting something similar, if indeed any could do so. I don't know, maybe the United Kingdom or France. It certainly wouldn't be easy, but that was only the beginning. For 12 days straight, morning, afternoon, and night, Israel was hitting targets on Iranian soil. Obviously, the Ayatollahs responded, but they did so with much less force than many expected. Even so, we saw missiles falling on Tel Aviv. I'm sure you all remember those images perfectly. In fact, over on Visualeconomik, we provided intensive coverage during those days. Well, the fact is that with a war underway, the risk of escalation, and a barrage of missiles launched against the country, the logical thing would be to expect, I don't know, at least some panic, right? Because if there's one thing we know about the markets, it's that they're as brave as a cat facing a vacuum cleaner. They flee at the slightest sign of trouble. Yet, do you know what happened in Israel? Exactly the opposite. In the Israeli financial markets, rather than panic, there was practically euphoria. According to data compiled by Bloomberg, during those 12 days, the currency, the stock market, and even the price of Israeli debt bonds skyrocketed. The shekel, for instance, appreciated by 7%. The price of debt bonds rebounded, which means that the cost of borrowing fell. Specifically, it experienced its biggest decline since 2011. And the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange? Well, that was on another level. In dollars, it rose by no less than 14% in 12 days, enough to become the most profitable market in the world during those days. Yeah, that's right. #1 on the planet, in the midst of war. In other words, while Israel was relentlessly pounding targets in Iran, the markets delivered a crushing verdict. The Hebrew country's victory would be so resounding that it would mark a turning point. Because on top of that, the Iranian campaign was not an isolated operation, but came following the victory over Hezbollah, the fall of al-Assad, and the war against Hamas in Gaza. And that's why this reaction from the financial markets was not a sudden outburst either, not at all. Since Netanyahu launched his all-out offensive against virtually all of Israel's enemies after the fateful 7th of October 2023, the country's financial markets have done just the opposite of what was expected. They have skyrocketed. And here's an important note, this is not a political issue, nor does it have anything to do with the legitimate concerns we may have about what is happening in Gaza. These are facts. Facts that are absolutely crucial to understanding Israel's future and Netanyahu's plans. The fact is that since 7th of October 2023, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has become practically the most successful stock market in the world. In dollars, its return is around 100%, double that of the S&P 500. And that's despite the fact that following the Hamas attack, the Israeli stock market plummeted. But since then, well, you can see for yourselves. I bet you didn't see that coming, did ya? It seems that both domestic and foreign investors are clearly betting on the same idea, that Israel's all-out offensive is clearing away once and for all the threats that have been hanging over the country for decades. The result? Less geopolitical risk, more confidence, and therefore a much higher valuation of all Israeli assets. In other words, the markets are betting on a new era for Israel. An era of greater stability, greater success, and much greater prosperity. And whether this is true or not, one thing is indisputable. This response from the financial markets has been nothing but fuel for Netanyahu, a leader who, far from putting on the brakes, has gone after more and more ambitious goals. In short, far from punishing him every time he's raised the stakes, the markets have rewarded him with a stronger currency, more joy on the stock market, and even a lower cost of public debt, which, truth be told, is paradoxical, because the budgetary reality is just the opposite, a gigantic hole in the public accounts. In 2024 alone, the military offensive left a deficit of close to 7% of GDP. This led both Standard & Poor's and Moody's to downgrade the country's credit rating, because naturally, such a large deficit leads to news stories like this.
Israel's national debt increased by 17.9% in 2024.
However, as you've seen, investors have been completely indifferent to all this. In the last 2 years, the Israeli financial markets have been skyrocketing, and the logical question is, why? What on earth has happened to suddenly unleash such a level of euphoria? Isn't the opposite supposed to happen when a country is at war? Doesn't fear push markets down? Well, the answer lies in the very nature of the Israeli economy. It's a special, unique economy, and above all, one marked by the true economic miracle that this country has experienced in recent decades. And no, I'm not exaggerating. While in 1980, Israel's GDP per capita was approximately half that of Germany, these days, according to the World Bank, they're already tied. We're talking about a country that is 11 times richer than its neighbor, Egypt, has more unicorns than all other Middle Eastern countries combined, and has won more Nobel Prizes than even China. In economic terms, Israel's last few decades have been a clear success story. For example, its GDP of $550 billion is now among the 30 largest in the world. And the truth, we only have to look at what has happened to wages. But let me say it again. What explains such a wave of prosperity? Why does this country seem immune to conflict? Is it really immune? Well, pay close attention to what comes next, because this is perhaps one of the least known facets of Israel in the world, and at the same time, something that has made the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange one of the most profitable on the planet so far in the 21st century. Listen up.
A war-proof economy.
First of all, it's important to understand that Israel was not always the success story we know today. In fact, many of its founders were staunch socialists, and so what they did was basically implement a state with a huge public system, high taxes, extensive regulation, many state-owned companies, and many collective production centers. In a way, we could almost say that in its early days, Israel was more like the Soviet Union than the United States. The result? Economic and financial crises were a constant, until, with government accounts in tatters, they made a sharp turn toward traditional capitalism. Many companies were privatized, taxes were adjusted, and it became much easier to start businesses and trade freely with the rest of the world. The result? Since the beginning of the 21st century, Israel has done the opposite of most other developed countries. Instead of raising taxes and increasing government spending, it has done exactly the opposite. It has reduced spending from 50% to 40% of GDP, provided many incentives to the productive sector, cut taxes, and its governments have taken the issue of debt quite seriously, managing to reduce it by more than 20 points of GDP. Above all, Israel decided to put all its eggs in the technological development basket, and that was a huge success. These days, it allocates more than 6% of its GDP to research and development. That's more than double the global average. The truth is that no other country comes close. In practice, Israel functions as a giant technological hub, home to a host of local and multinational companies. In fact, almost half of that R&D spending is carried out by foreign corporations which, despite all the geopolitical turmoil, have opened dozens and dozens, or rather hundreds, of innovation centers on Israeli soil. And yes, as you may have guessed, the military industry plays a more than significant role here. But let's not fool ourselves. Israel's success cannot be explained solely by the tanks or drones it's capable of producing. If we had to distill all this success we're talking about into a couple of key points, they would be these. First key point. The technology industry is by far the most significant economic activity in the country. Neither trade, construction, nor traditional industry can compete with its enormous contribution to the national economy. We're talking about the fact that in 2022, this sector already represented more than 18% of GDP. And the best thing is that it continues to grow. Soon, this figure will exceed 20%. And to give you an idea, this figure in the United States, the home of Silicon Valley, Google, Apple, and the big tech giants, is just over 9%. Not only that, Israel has more startups per capita than anywhere else in the world. For example, with 73 startups, it already has the third largest AI ecosystem on the planet, behind only the United States and China. And by the way, it also ranks third for countries in the world with the most companies listed on the Nasdaq exchange. And all this, remember, with a population of just over 9 million. Crazy. The second key factor. Although this type of activity, technology, is not usually a very labor-intensive industry, in Israel it already directly employs more than 500,000 people, accounting for 14% of all jobs in the country. This largely explains their low unemployment rates, because here, unemployment is just over 3%. In other words, there's basically full employment. And pay attention to this fact. In the last decade alone, technology jobs have grown by more than 80%. But it's not just that there are more jobs, they're also much better paid. Today, the average salary in the technology sector exceeds 6,500 euros a month per worker. Yes, that's right, 6,500 euros. That's about $7,600. No joke. And thirdly, there's foreign trade. Thanks to everything we've seen so far, Israeli productivity has not only taken off, but its companies have also begun to conquer the world. Today, half of the country's exports are high value-added technology products, a proportion that smashes the records of virtually any developed economy. From military systems to air traffic control and cybersecurity activities. In fact, Israel is, alongside the United States, the world's leading software power. The result is that all this has become a veritable gold mine. The Israeli economy functions as a kind of supermarket of advanced solutions, open 24/7 to the entire planet, and the money keeps flowing, with or without war. Of course, that's not all. As well as its powerful technology industry, Israel also has three other key factors that explain the economic miracle it has experienced in recent decades. Take, for example, the last decade, when large natural gas deposits began to be exploited in Israel's territorial waters. On the one hand, this has meant that the country has reduced its imports of coal and other fuels, and on the other, that it has begun to supply its neighboring countries, and also the rest of Europe. We're talking about an economic impact of billions and billions of dollars each year. In a way, Israel is already an energy powerhouse right now. Then, in 2020, the Abraham Accords were signed. Under these agreements, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain first, and Morocco and Sudan later, recognized the State of Israel and established completely normal diplomatic relations. And do you know what? This is translated into a veritable flood of money for the Jewish state, especially from the United Arab Emirates. Billions of dollars in new investments have poured in from this Arab country, while trade, as you can see, has skyrocketed. And take note, because if Saudi Arabia joins these agreements in the future, the shower of millions could multiply. And finally, Israel is a very young country with fairly high birth rates. In other words, unlike most developed economies in the West, there are no problems with demographic aging here. Well, all of this is precisely what explains why the Tel Aviv stock market has skyrocketed. Why? Because the country is a real powerhouse when it comes to creating high value-added technology businesses. And now, following the operations that Netanyahu launched on October 7th, two ideas have taken hold in the markets. On the one hand, many of the geopolitical risks that have plagued Israel for years are about to disappear. And on the other hand, everyone assumes that when this crisis passes, Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords, triggering the huge influx of millions we mentioned a moment ago. Meanwhile, the war has meant that the state would inject a lot of money into the military industry, which is exactly what has happened. Add to this the huge explosion in military spending that is taking place in Europe and around the world in general, along with the widespread arrival of AI, and there you have it. You can understand everything that is happening in the markets in this country. The result is surely no longer surprising to you. The last 2 years have been explosive, and thanks to that, so far this century, that's in the last 25 years, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has pulverized Wall Street. And bear in mind that we're talking about a period of 25 years, which is quite representative. Because look, since the beginning of 2000, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has multiplied in dollars by 7.3, while the S&P 500 has multiplied by 4.5. On top of that, we would have to add dividends. But here too, the Israeli stock market wins. Of course, there's no guarantee that this will happen again. There are many risks along the way. If it doesn't end soon, the war could delay or even put an end to many technological investments. Public finances will emerge from all this in a much worse state. Israel's image and its ability to attract talent may be suffering in ways we haven't seen in a long time. And that's a problem, because the country's tech industry is already so large that it needs to attract a lot of international talent to remain competitive. And then there's the issue of the growing demographic and political presence of the most ultra-conservative sectors, particularly, of course, the ultra-orthodox population. In the long run, this poses a considerable potential problem. Keep in mind that this group has very low levels of employability. The majority of the ultra-orthodox population does not work. What's more, they have a lot of children, which means that they represent an increasingly large part of Israel's population. In 2020, for example, 1/5 of all children who started primary school did so in the ultra-orthodox system. A system in which only subjects such as basic mathematics and English are taught at a bare bones level, and only up to the age of 12. The rest of the time is devoted entirely to religious classes. And in the long run, as you can imagine, this will pose a significant challenge. But we've already talked about this many times on Visualeconomik. The point is that in the first 25 years of the 21st century, Israel has been, above all else, a huge economic and financial success. And if the war has done anything, it's been to add fuel to this process, as you've seen. Who would have thought? And take note that this also leaves us with an absolutely crucial lesson. Countries that do things right, and where technology plays an important role, can be a source of great opportunities, to the point of pulverizing the S&P 500 over a 25-year period. But now that we've come this far, the questions are, did you know about this other side of Israel? Do you know of any other market in the world that could blow away the S&P 500 over the next 25 years, as Israel has done over the last 25? Well, tell us what you think down in the comments below. And remember, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for being there. All the best. I'll see you in the next one.